Welcome to Between Authors. I'm your host, author Adrian Lopez. What is it that excites us as a reader? It's finding that book or author that you may never have heard of, sort of like the treasure hunt for a reader. The goal from my podcast is to bring to you either those authors or those books that you may never have found, but may be the treasure you've been hunting for all along. Today I'm at episode 61. I bring to you author Sav Uong. We're going to go over a little bit about who she is, what she's published, what she's working on, and maybe what her plans are for the future. Welcome to the show, Sav.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. I'm Sav. I write queer mafia romance and other queer projects in the future, and I'm very excited to be here.
Happy to have you here today as well. So you've done a little bit of an introduction to you and what you do. Why don't you explain to the viewers sort of your influences? What started you on your writing career and what influences you? And it doesn't necessarily have to be authors and books.
So I always, whenever somebody asks, how did you start writing? I always give the same answer, which is when I was 6 years old, I told my mom, "Mommy, I'm not tired. I don't want to go to sleep." And she said, "Tell yourself a story silently in your head and you'll fall asleep." And so I did that, and I have been doing that ever since. So that is now, I did the math the other day, that is 27 years in the making of just constantly going to sleep, telling my stories every night. And it's fostered a love of learning, fostered a love of storytelling, and fostered a love of writing.
And influences?
Influences, probably a little bit of everything. I like movies, I like shows, I like podcasts, and I was a very, very avid reader. Probably the two authors, though, that got me actually writing and being able to finish what I wrote were a combination of Neil Gaiman and Brandon Sanderson, not necessarily because of the things they wrote, but because of how they themselves talk about writing and the writing process. And Brandon Sanderson has his college lectures online for free for you to go watch, and they're wonderful resources to just pick up the craft and figure out what works for you.
For those that haven't seen that, is that on YouTube or is that on his website?
Yes.
Or
yeah, YouTube? No, that's on YouTube. Like I said, they're all free. If you type in BYU Brandon Sanderson lectures, it should pop up. It is specifically a sci-fi fantasy lecture course, but he does go into the publishing industry. He goes into writing. Well, he does not go into writing short stories, because anybody who knows Sanderson knows that man can't write a short story to save his life. The word short is not in his vocabulary. But he brings people on. It did happen right as the pandemic hit, so some of his lectures go from being in a classroom to in his home. But they're wonderful resources, and he goes into, indie author publishing and all of that. Most of what I knew about indie author publishing before I started talking to indie authors came from his lectures.
Yeah, that's a great resource for those that don't know that. I'll actually leave the link down below that in the description for people to be able to find that.
Yeah, it's a great thing. I watched it on repeat for a month.
So you are indie author, self-published, correct?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
How has that journey been for you once you started?
Mildly terrifying, anxiety-inducing. So what it was is I wrote a book around the end of the pandemic. I had lost my grandma and I just needed, things to do. So I wrote a 150,000 plus word fantasy novel, and then set it to the side. And I had been reading more Mafia books at the time, and we weren't quite getting, that the itch that you need. I want this very specific story, and I couldn't find that in any of the books that I was reading.
Yeah.
So then I wrote my own. And then I promptly wrote 3 more. And then I rewrote them all the next year. And my mom made a comment about, you're spending all this time writing, but you haven't finished anything. I said, I have finished things. I finished like 3 of them. And she's like, well, why haven't you published them? And I'm like, and I mentioned it to, I'm actually a paralegal professionally. And I mentioned it to my attorney who had self-published a book about her life. And so she introduced me to something called Upwork, which is like, if you've ever heard of Fiverr, it's similar to that.
Yeah.
You can find editors, cover artists, all of that sort of thing. So I went ahead with her guidance, put up a thing for my cover art, like just looking for somebody to look for a cover artist. And I found Adam, my cover artist, and he was amazing. And as soon as I had that cover, I went, oh shoot, things are real now. Now I have a cover. So now I have to see it through. And that was back in September, October of last year. So I published The Cat's Mouse in December with some help of a friend of mine doing the editing. And then, so I published that in December, and then I rewrote The Hacker's Heart in January, and then got that edited and got the book cover for that. And now it's coming out in April, and I'm already working on book number 3, and it kind of snowballs.
Yeah.
Once you
get started, it just keeps going.
Right. Becomes a little addictive, a little crazy.
Yeah. Yeah. It's very interesting. I mean, the whole indie author process is interesting because you do everything, right? So basically you do everything on your own. And it is interesting because it's that final step of putting your work out there that sometimes everybody has the problem with, right? Because you could do all the writing, you get it ready to go. It's sometimes it's just that little push to put it out there. And once you do it, you're good to go. But sometimes that little step is difficult. It's a difficult thing to do. But yeah, it's interesting. I always like asking that question because I really am interested how everybody comes to writing and doing it their own way.
Right.
And it's actually a pretty good, thing for indie authors and you made a good point about you were doing a lot of reading, but you couldn't find that story that you wanted, right? And that's the beauty of being an indie author is you can do it. You get a lot of us are writing the stories we want to read because we can't find them. And that's the beauty of doing this is you can do it any way you want. Where you're traditionally published, you got to sometimes get some of that stuff approved and they may change it a little. As an indie author, it's whatever you want to do, right? You can take it any direction you want.
Right. That's probably my favorite thing is like, I ask people like, check me, make sure that I'm not overstepping a boundary, make sure, especially since, I am bi, but I am still a I am a cis woman. So, I have to, and I'm writing about gay men currently. So I have to, check me on this. And I've got non-binary characters that are coming, and I've got heavy topics because it's mafia. So there's always going to be a heavy topic involved. And I'm like, everybody, please check me if I'm overstepping something. So far, nobody's been like, what is wrong with you? I mean, they've been like, what is wrong with you? But in like the good author way.
Yeah.
I have been yelled at, like, Sav, but never... Never in the back.
But it's a good thing because again, the beauty of this, really, the beauty of the whole thing is there is an audience for your voice, right? And like you said, you're not sure if you're going too far, if somebody wants to read that or you're taking it the direction. The audience is there. There's an audience for your voice, no matter what the voice is, right?
Right.
The key or the struggle, as all of us know, is having that audience find our work, because that's the most difficult part, right? Having them get the eyes on what we create. But there is, and I always like to say that there is an audience for your voice, no matter what you write, how you approach it. There's an audience out there. It's just how do you guys find each other, right? How does your
Mhm.
work get in front of them? But yeah, it's very interesting. When you do that, especially when you do it from a different point of view or different direction, there
Right.
is always that doubt. You're like, are they going to like this? Because it is different than what you've seen. But that's the point. If you're questioning it and saying, I really would like to read this, it's almost guaranteed there's others questioning the same thing, right? So
Right.
it's there. It's can you find them? That's always going to be the struggle for all of us indie authors is how do we get our stuff out there and get eyes on it?
Right.
So let's talk about your first book. I know you have it with you. Why don't you put it up so everybody can see the cover? Uh, Perfect. So let's talk about the book. Why don't you give us a quick summary or synopsis about what that book is about?
Absolutely. So, all of my books, or at least all of the ones where they'll have these three rings on them, is the Three Rings series. They are queer mafia romances. Most of them focus on gay men, so they also fall under that romance. But there are other representations that come through. And The Cat's Mouse is about a college student named Isaac Mouse who is working his way through his master's degree in college for political science and is homeless at the time. And one night he breaks into a warehouse to sleep because he has no place else to go. And he wanders into Felness Il Gato Drago working. Uh, they strike a deal to spend the night together in exchange for him being able to stay safe and warm. And that then snowballs into a much bigger deal for Felness to take care of Isaac and all of the things that come from that, including some dark secrets that Isaac has about his past that he has been keeping secret and hidden for the majority of his life.
And this one you said came out last year, correct? Toward the end of
Yeah.
last year?
December 5th of 2023 is when this came out.
Okay. So do you have in that book, do you have a favorite scene that stands out to you?
Yes, my favorite scene, and I know it's my favorite scene because part of my writing process is I rewrite the book 3 times, and the scene stayed in almost exactly every single time I wrote it, which is the morning after Felonious brings Isaac home. His Felonious's brother is making breakfast, and he's mad at him for just bringing all of this into things. And Felonious is like, no, he needs help and he's too stubborn and all of that. And his brother Brutus looks at him and he goes, so he's a brat. And Felonious looks at him, he's like, what? And Brutus goes, he's a brat. You like brats. It's the only consistent thing about your dating history. And he is not he's a bit of a brat. And that is probably my favorite line, my favorite scene, because it just kind of encapsulates this brotherly relationship these two mobsters have with one another.
Yeah. On the opposite end of that, did you have a hard scene in the book?
So one of the characters that show up a little later in the book has a heavy Irish accent that in later books I actually have to dial back because it was a very hard thing for people to read, and that character specifically has a fairly long monologue where he's telling another character a story of things that happened. And it was difficult to write because I can hear it in my head, but hearing it in my head and writing down the accent without overdoing it, and I overdid it. Like, that's part of being an indie author, is admitting when you didn't necessarily do this correctly. So
Yeah.
Future books that have him talking a lot, I have to dial back because it's just too much for people to read.
But that's one of the things, right? You get better the more you do it, right? You
Right.
see, I don't want to say mistakes, but you see things where you could have improved on,
Right.
or as you go through the process, you go, you know what, I could do this a better way.
Mhm.
And that goes with anything, right? Anything you continually do or do more and more, you'll just get better at. So it's an interesting point because you will find that you will see things, or sometimes you go back and read earlier stuff, and you're like, "Hey, how did
Right.
how did I come up
No,
with that?"
I was telling somebody I found the original draft of this book and I cringed so hard. I'm like, "Oh, it's so bad. No, make it stop."
Yep.
There was nothing wrong with it, really. Like, at the end of it all, I just didn't like it anymore. At the time, I enjoyed myself immensely writing it, but
Yeah, but that's the process, right? That
right,
first draft is very rarely what you finish with, right? And like you
right,
said, you're doing 3 times. Sometimes you don't rewrite the entire thing thoroughly, but you do sometimes. Who knows how many variations of the story as you
right,
go through and keep doing it. So it's very, very rarely, or if at all, is ever that first draft that you started with.
right.
Yeah,
I know.
that's crazy.
I think anybody
Uh,
who says that, "Oh, no, it's the same as when it was the first draft," I'm like, "You are a liar!
yeah,
You
or they
liar!"
never reread it, right? They just
Or
they
that.
just put it out there and
Right,
published it. Um, Research, right? So I always like to ask the question, what type of research did you do for your book? Because it's a good reminder for younger writers. You need to do research, right? Even if it's a
right,
small amount of something, because it is almost guaranteed that the one reader that knows what you're trying to talk about will read your book and will find it, right? And that's what you
right,
always want to try to avoid.
right. So, I accidentally fell into the, write what you know. So I have always been a big fan of mafia, organized crime. The Prohibition is actually one of my favorite um, eras of history because of all the organized crime that come from there. So I didn't have to do too much research
Mhm.
into the Italians mafias, but there was also Russians and Irish mobs in here. So I had to do a fair amount of, if nothing else, just what they call everybody, like what the titles are, how they're structured. Um, the Russians still make me want to do my head in because I cannot figure out exactly how their spies work. I am still confused on that, but they're not the focus here, so it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Um, but I know about them. I just am confused constantly. And then I'm convinced the Irish just kind of make it up as they go along. Um, but I also had to do a fair bit of medical research about malnutrition for the cat's mouse because that is part of Isaac's the reasoning behind Isaac taking the deal is because he is so malnourished that they're like he will not make it to the new year if this continues and it's September. So they're like, no, he needs a lot of food. So I had to like look up how one treats malnutrition, what kind of foods they would be feeding him, how you go about feeding somebody who has malnutrition
Yeah.
in the best ways. Because eating a lot of food all at once would be very difficult if you're just not used to eating.
Yeah. Or probably greasy, fatty food would be difficult for the system as well.
Right. So
Yeah.
it's things like a lot of dairies, a lot of pastas are actually pretty good, but also a lot of finger foods is what I learned, which was a fascinating thing that comes into the story later, because people keep making him like small, like somebody makes him small pancakes, and he's just like, "Why do I have tiny pancakes?" And they're like, "Oh, because I did research, and this is what the research said." And he just looks at them, he's like, "You did research on malnutrition?" You are the mafia, right? You did research on. You didn't need to do that. So I had to do research on that.
Yeah, curious question. Have you ever thought about doing a period piece with the Prohibition?
I have, and probably wouldn't necessarily do it with the Prohibition, and I don't really have a reason other than none of the characters are springing forth at the moment. But I do have, I am currently, like, for the fun of it, off to the side to entertain myself, because that's what also being an indie author is. I'm entertaining myself here.
Yeah.
Is I'm writing a circus story, which is based not quite Prohibition, but that early 1900s era of circus and all of that. So I do have a couple of era pieces. They're just not quite there yet.
Okay. So you mentioned you have book 2 coming out. I believe you said April 4th.
Yes.
So why don't you give us the name of that one and give us, a summary or synopsis with what you want to share so far.
Absolutely. So the second book is The Hacker's Heart. So none of the books are direct continuations of the previous couple. However, the previous couple is always there in the background. So in The Cat's Mouse, it was Isaac and Felinus, and in The Hacker's Heart, one of Felinus's men is Sung Snake Kim. He is a hacker for the Italian mafia. It is his story with a young man that you meet at the end of The Hacker's Heart, or at the end of The Cat's Mouse, that I can't tell you about until you read, because it's major spoilers.
Yeah.
But he gets involved in things, and then this is their story, and the two of them coming together and growing together from the traumatic things that happened to Thomas, our cute little redhead here that I love so much. He's so adorable.
So, again, I want to ask you these questions without you doing any spoilers or giving anything away. So if you can answer it, don't worry. But, similar to the other book, do you have a favorite scene in there? And do you have a hard scene? But again, I don't want you spoiling anything.
Right. So I think my favorite scene, and it's not spoilery. So if you couldn't tell by the fact that he's redhead, he is connected to the Irish mafia in all of this. And a quick thing aside for the Three Rings is the reason it's called the Three Rings is because there are 3 mafias, and that's how their territories are laid out in the city, is a ring style. And so Thomas is at a Christmas party, and the Irish phrase for Santa Claus can be translated to Daddy December. And so there's a joke amongst the young people to try to get the head of the Irish mafia to go on a tangent about calling him Daddy December, because he doesn't like it. But he does call himself the Irish phrase for it on all of their Christmas presents, because he buys all of them Christmas presents. And so it's a tradition every year for them to try and get him to go off on a tangent about it. And I love that entire Christmas party scene is just very sweet and cute, and it's like a sense of normalcy for him after a lot of not normal things happened.
Yep. On the opposite side, did you have a hard scene in there?
I did. And that scene has to do with some trauma that Snake experienced, and him telling Thomas about it after something happened with Thomas where Snake had to step in to get him safe. And then the next morning, Snake reveals that he has some trauma, and he tells Thomas the whole story. And it was a difficult thing because originally when I wrote it, I wrote the entire chapter in first person. Like, it was just him talking so much that I'm like, I'll just write this whole thing in first person. And then I changed it after the fact to no, it's him, the quotations and all of that. And so it's just a very dialogue heavy, talking at you chapter. And trying to figure out how to balance that out was it's not the easiest thing I wrote. I'm a little bit known, like anybody who reads my things usually end up talking about my dialogue, so I am quite good at dialogue and like interactions and bantering and all of that sort of thing, but having an entire chapter or half a chapter just be somebody talking, just him, like it's just him talking. Thomas is not interrupting, Thomas isn't asking any questions, it's just Snake talking is a difficult thing to do. There's a balance to that.
Yeah. Yeah, because it's a big monologue that's going on. So it is difficult sometimes to balance that out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Did you do any separate research for this book? Like you said, some of the stuff you had already known for the first book, but did you do anything different for this one?
I had to look up how roofies work. That was my big, like, I spent a lot of time searching how somebody acted under roofies, how, why it is that they're so hard to trace. I had, previous to writing this, come across somebody who was working on creating a nail polish that would react to the roofie drug. It actually is a white polish that turns blue when it is introduced. Like if you put your fingers in the drink, it's supposed to turn blue. And that actually makes it into the story. I don't think it's a thing that you can actually buy, unfortunately, because I think that is an amazing product that like everybody should have, especially club goers. Like just paint one nail and stick in your drink every single time. But it is something that makes it into the Hacker's Heart. And then I needed to just know everything. And then I had a very lovely website pop up, and it was actually a rehab, and be like, do you need help? And I'm like, nope, just research. Please don't put me on the list.
Yeah.
I promise. Yeah. I promise it's just for fictional purposes.
I'd interviewed another author. She was doing some research in Australia where she was from.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't remember right now what she was researching, but the government actually reached out to her. So I was always joking around with her about her being on the watch list for the Australian government. But sometimes that's what happens when you do some of this research. You get kind of filtered a certain direction. So.
Right. Luckily, I've watched enough true crime in life that I've never had to like research how to hide a body, because I already know that. But that is more concerning, probably, that you're just like, oh yeah, I already know how to do that.
Yeah, no.
Why do you know how to do that? Do you know how much crime drama I watch and consume and true crime?
They're very detailed.
Right. Do you know how many serial killers I know about? I'm good.
I've been researching for 10 years.
Right.
I know everything there needs to be known.
Right.
So I know you mentioned, I think you said there's a third book that goes with this series.
Mm-hmm.
Is that what you're currently working on, or do you have a couple other things that you're kind of, because a lot of times, a lot of us we're all over the place writing back and forth.
Right. So I am working, I'm actually working on a couple of things all at once because I'm too ADHD for my own good. So like I mentioned, there was a circus story that has absolutely nothing to do with nobody. It had everything to do with, I went to a museum for the circus and was inspired. And I'm like, so the third book that will be for the Three Rings is The Dog Trainer's Secret. I'm 34,000 words into that. I started writing it last month. No, actually I started writing it earlier this month. And then the circus, and then there's also a Lovecraftian and Fae story serial that I'm working on, but I can't quite. I want to try and do it as like a monster of the week, but I can't quite get it to do the thing I want it to do.
Yeah.
So it can be a monster of the week story. So it's sitting on a back burner. Then I have my Substacks, which is stories usually from the Three Rings. It might branch out later, but they're usually like, you've read this, now here's a few other things for you to chew on while I work on other books. So right after I finished The Cat's Mouse and I released it, I released a Christmas story. I want to say I released it on Christmas Eve so people could read it, while, cozied up and waiting for Christmas to happen. Then I've released a couple of more things since then. And then The Hacker's Heart will actually have an exclusive bonus chapter in the paperback. But since I know that not everybody can have, kissy boys on their bookshelf for one reason or another, it is there's money reasons, there's space reasons, there's safety reasons that you don't have this. So I have all of my books on KU. I am releasing that bonus chapter 1 month after release. So May 4th, the bonus chapter will be available on my Substacks. And then I have a couple of little projects that I'm working on with some author friends of mine. There's a time travel story that I'm working on with my friend Jonathan. He, myself, and another author, Jasmine Wallace, are working on a little fun crossover thing that won't really have any impact on the Three Rings as a whole because they have magic and I do not. And so that's just been our fun little thing of my guys sitting over here like, we don't believe in magic. And they're like, well, you do now. And then also there's a paranormal romance anthology that I'm working on with Jasmine Wallace as well that I'm hoping to get done. And that'll be released around Halloween, I believe. So a lot of little things as I also do the third book of this series. And there will actually be, I'm up to like 5 or 6 planned books for the Three Rings. Okay. And then eventually I would like to get back to that fantasy book that started it all and actually get it working and corrected and good because it's not as good.
For the fantasy one, did you build a whole world out for it?
Yes. So the fantasy one is it's high fantasy, but there's only humans sort of thing, but it's very heavy magic. And then I created all the countries and all of that. But when I first started writing it, what happened is I told myself a story one night and I had this scene stuck in my head of a man breaking into a prince's room and holding him up against the wall at knife point. And I could not get that scene out of my head. So I started writing it, and then I kept writing it, and then I kept writing it. And then the next thing I know, I'm 150,000 words in and I finished it. And I went, how'd I do that? I never finish these things. When you're done. You're done. Fuck.
So, an interesting question I like to ask for anybody who writes fantasy is, you spend a lot of effort and work building the world. So my question is always, do you think or do you feel at some point you may use that world again? Maybe not in the same storyline, but similar to like Star Wars or the Marvel Universe, where you're in the world, in the universe, but they're completely different storylines sometimes.
So that's actually how the Lovecraft Fae serial started. What happened with that one was somebody actually was asking for methods of, I was in a writing group and they were asking for methods of dropping world building without, giving a whole exposition. So I did a, description of the fact that, it's gaslight. So it was a gaslight steampunk magic urban fantasy setting. So, the lights were green because that's the color of the ley lines. And then there was a carriage being pulled along, but there was no, or the horse also had green eyes. So it was magically fabricated. And I had just written this scene for this person for an example. And I'm like, I'm having too much fun, so I'm going to keep writing this.
Yeah.
And then I wrote 100,000 words somehow for that. And then I scrapped the whole thing and said, no, I don't like how that's going. I couldn't find the ending is what the problem was. Is I could not find where the story ended. So I scrapped the whole thing. And I said, okay, well, because it was based in a college. And I'm like, okay, well, instead of it being the professor and the teacher, let's make them 2 students. And then, so I started writing that. I think I got about 20,000 words into that. I didn't like how that was going. So I scrapped that whole thing. And then I'm like, okay, well, instead of it and this is all based in a world around World War I or II, like right after one of the world wars. I'm like, okay, well, instead of doing that, what if we do there's no more college. Nobody's in college anymore. Screw college. College is annoying. And I started working on something totally different again, and then I scrapped all of that. And now it's a Monster of the Week story that does not want to behave itself. So you can I'm determined it will work eventually.
After about 2 million words, you'll release something.
Somebody's gonna find my hard drive one day and just be like, was she okay? No. The answer is no.
So the last question I like to ask, it's kind of like a bucket list question, right? So in your career as an author, right, after you've done some of these things that you're currently writing or that you're planning on working on, is there something that you want to make sure that you do as an author? And it could be, the answer could be simply go back to the fantasy and finalize that, because that's not technically the genre you're in. Or maybe it's another genre, or maybe a storyline you've kind of thrown around a little bit, but you just haven't really dug into it yet.
Mm-hmm. There actually was something, and I am upset because I cannot remember what it was. I saw somebody talking about something, and I'm like, new author goal unlocked. But I can't, because a lot of people are like, oh, I want to see my books in a store. I want to see my book made into a movie, or those different things. And I don't necessarily have, it would be great. I think personally, like the 3 Rings would make a fantastic HBO series, along with like the Peaky Blinders or Boardwalk Empire, like something to that effect. I think it would make a great series for that, but I'm not. Oh, I remember what it was now. I was joking around with my friend Jonathan, who's another author. His book's actually coming out in April as well. And we jokingly started talking about if the 3 Rings was a musical, it would be along the same lines of West Side Story and all the dancing and the aggressive snapping and all of that. And I'm like, new author goal unlocked. I want a musical. Somebody make the 3 Rings. Somebody make the Cat's Mouse into a musical. And I need a We Got Annie style song for the mall scene, because there's a scene in the book where Felinus takes Isaac shopping and is just like buying him all new clothes and shoes and wallet. Like he's like, your stuff is terrible and doesn't fit you anyway, so I'm buying you new stuff. Shut up and say thank you. And so I just want an entire scene, like the scene in Annie when she goes to the mansion for the first time, where Isaac's just being super like prickly and upset about the fact that he's having to be dressed up, and every time the the actor for Felonious touches him, he just immediately melts. And so that is what I want. I want to reach a point where theater kids get a hold of my book and they do that scene. That is my bucket list. I will die happy.
That's funny because you're the first one that's mentioned a musical out of their book. But I can see what you're talking about, right? I can understand that.
Right, like that, and it's because I love musicals, like just in general. I am a huge fan of all things. If it's got a show tune in it, I'm probably there.
That's great. Hopefully that happens. That would be interesting to see that.
Maybe
somebody actually does do that.
Maybe somebody will watch this and be like, "Oh, is that what
you
she
never
wants?"
know, right? You never know.
Right.
I definitely want to thank you for coming on. I've had a great time with the conversation and chatting with you. I do want to remind the viewers that I will leave all the links below for Sav's stuff, links to the books, links to websites, socials, anything she wants to share. Everything will be down below. Definitely leave us a comment if you have any questions for either of us. We'd love to see that and give you an answer, give you a response. And definitely don't forget to subscribe and hit the notifications so you don't miss all these amazing, talented authors that I have coming up. I really do appreciate you coming on today. I had a great time.
I really appreciate you having me on. This was a blast.
Yeah,
this is also the first time anybody's seen my face. So hi, people.
Your debut?
My face debut. Is it everything you thought it was going to be?
But like I said, thank you for coming on, and thank you, viewers, for watching as well. Goodbye.
Thank you.